The day after Mom passed, my sister claimed the $300,000 was hers until the bank called me first. I didn't expect the house to feel so hollow the morning after Mom passed. The light coming through the curtains felt dimmer, as if even the sun understood something was missing. I moved slowly through the kitchen, touching the back of a chair she always pulled out first, noticing the faint smell of her lavender soap still lingering in the air. Everything felt familiar, yet wrong, as though the whole place had exhaled and emptied itself overnight. I tried to make coffee, but the sound of the machine sputtering filled me with a heaviness I couldn't explain. It wasn't grief in the loud, overwhelming way people talk about. It was quieter, like a weight that settled behind my ribs. The house felt paused, holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. I didn't feel ready to be that person. I just wanted one more morning where I could pretend things hadn't changed. My phone buzzed a few times, messages from relatives offering condolences. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Words felt cheap that day. I needed silence. I needed the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the wall clock to drown out the reality that Mom's chair at the table would always be empty now. The emptiness wrapped around me like a blanket I didn't ask for. I sat down with my hands around the warm mug, letting the steam brush my face. For a moment, I tried to breathe in the comfort it offered, but instead, a strange nervousness washed over me, as if something was about to shift again. Grief can make you paranoid, I guess. It can turn the smallest sounds into warnings. I couldn't explain it, but I felt unsettled, like the atmosphere in the house was thick with unfinished conversations. When the knock came at the door, it made my heart jump. It wasn't loud, just 2 quick taps, but in the stillness of the house, it echoed like someone pounding. I wiped my eyes, unsure whether I was ready to face anyone, but when I cracked the door open, I found my sister Rachel standing there, looking composed in a way that didn't match the occasion. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes were sharp rather than swollen from crying. She didn't ask if she could come in. She just stepped past me, carrying a folder tucked under her arm. The scent of her perfume, something citrusy and too bright for a morning like this, filled the hallway as she walked toward the kitchen. I felt my shoulders tense without understanding why. Maybe it was the way she moved, purposeful and fast, like she had timed her arrival down to the minute. I followed her into the kitchen, feeling strangely out of place in my own home. She sat at the table, setting the folder down with a soft thud. Her fingers tapped lightly against the cover, a habit she had when she was impatient. She didn't look at the chair Mom used to sit in. She didn't seem affected by it at all. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Grief wasn't supposed to look the same for everyone, but something about her calmness pressed on a bruise inside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I tried to read her expression, but her face was an unreadable mask, tight around the mouth and focused. My heart thudded a little faster. It felt like she had come for something, not simply to check on me. The air around her carried a kind of tension, the kind that hinted at unfinished business. I wondered when she had stopped looking like my sister and started looking like someone I barely recognized. She glanced around the kitchen, her eyes flicking briefly over Mom's things, her glasses on the counter, her teacup by the sink, without a hint of emotion. The lack of pause made my chest ache. I felt like I was standing in 2 realities at once, one where I was drowning in memories, and one where she seemed untouched by any of them. Her composure felt unnatural, like she had already moved on to whatever came next. I sat across from her, gripping my mug to keep my hand steady. Something in me knew she wasn't here to share stories or lean on each other the way siblings are supposed to. There was a disconnect between us, a long stretch of unspoken words and unresolved moments trailing behind her like a shadow. I could sense she had rehearsed this visit in her head, down to how she would place that folder on the table. She cleared her throat softly, almost as though she were preparing to give a presentation rather than talk about our mother. The sound was small but sharp, cutting through the room's fragile quiet. I watched her inhale, her shoulders rising in a controlled breath. The kitchen suddenly felt colder, as if her presence had changed the temperature. I wasn't sure I was ready for the conversation she intended to have. I thought I'd have more time before the world started moving again. Time to be still, to process, to let the first wave of grief settle. But as I sat across from Rachel, Watching her straighten the folder with precise movements, I realized the world wasn't waiting for me. It never had. Things were shifting whether I liked it or not. And in that moment, a soft ache settled in my chest, reminding me that nothing about the days ahead would be simple, and I didn't notice the way Rachel's eyes followed me at first, tracking every movement I made as if she was waiting for the right moment to speak. I was still clinging to the fragile quiet of the morning, trying to steady my breathing, but she seemed unaffected by the weight in the room. Her posture was rigid, her fingers resting lightly on the folder as though it were something precious. When she finally exhaled, it was a slow, controlled release, the kind someone gives before delivering news they've already convinced themselves is justified. She looked at me with a focus that felt out of place for two siblings in mourning. There was no softness in her expression, no grief I could recognize. Instead, there was purpose, a sense of ownership. As she leaned forward slightly, the citrus scent of her perfume drifted across the table again, almost masking the fading scent of Mom that still clung to the house. The contrast made my stomach tighten. Grief had settled in me like a heavy fog. She, meanwhile, looked like she had slept well and arrived prepared. The moment she opened the folder, something cold stirred in my chest. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she neatly arranged the papers inside, smoothing a bent corner with the edge of her nail. It was the kind of fidgeting she did when she wanted control over a situation. I felt myself brace before I even knew why. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. What she said next didn't sound like a sister grieving our mom. It sounded like someone staking a claim. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Her tone carried a quiet authority, the kind people use when they've already decided the outcome. I felt the air leave my lungs in one slow rush. Her words didn't fit into the fragile space of mourning we were supposed to share. They cut through it instead, sharp and final. As she kept talking, I found myself gripping the edge of my chair. A faint ringing buzzed in my ears, the kind that comes when your mind is trying to catch up to reality. She spoke with confidence, almost rehearsed certainty, explaining herself as though her perspective was undeniably correct. The way she emphasized certain phrases, words like obvious, fair, and expected, made it sound like she believed the matter was already settled, or that it should be. I watched her hands as she gestured toward the papers. Her nails were perfectly manicured, each movement precise and deliberate. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't even nervous. There was no tremor in her fingers, no catch in her voice. It was as if she had walked into a business meeting instead of her siblings' kitchen the day after losing our mother. That disconnect dug into me deeper than the words themselves. The papers she slid toward me were copies, mismatched, disorganized, but the way she laid them out implied they held irrefutable proof. I didn't touch them. I couldn't. My hands felt heavy and numb, and part of me didn't trust what might happen if I picked them up. She kept talking, her voice steady, explaining things in a tone that suggested I should already understand her logic. But I didn't. The more she spoke, the more distant I felt, as though the room were slowly tilting. A faint draft brushed across my arm from the hallway, reminding me the house wasn't as warm as it used to be. I could almost picture Mom standing there, listening quietly, her gentle presence filling the space with the warmth that now felt so absent. That thought made my throat tighten. I blinked hard, trying to stay grounded, but Rachel didn't seem to notice my internal unraveling. Her focus was entirely on the point she was making, as if she had anticipated my confusion and prepared counterarguments. As she continued, something unspoken shifted between us. There was a calculation in her eyes, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. It felt like she was watching for resistance, ready to push harder if I questioned her. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, slow but heavy. She wasn't grieving. She was positioning herself. Every sentence she delivered seemed designed to leave me with fewer and fewer options. At one point, her voice softened just slightly, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt strategic, the way someone lowers their tone to appear reasonable while tightening their grip on a situation. She folded her hands neatly on the table, waiting for me to agree, or at least to stop looking so stunned. But I couldn't force myself to nod. My mind was still trying to process the fact that she had chosen this morning, of all mornings, to bring this into my home. I felt a tightness behind my eyes, not from tears, but from a deep, heavy disappointment. I kept waiting for her expression to crack, for some hint of shared pain or vulnerability to slip through. But her features remained composed, unwavering. She didn't seem to notice the way my shoulders sagged or how I stared down at the table instead of at her. Her focus stayed on the documents like they were the only thing that mattered. The weight of her certainty pressed against me until I felt small in my own kitchen. The morning light had shifted slightly, landing across the table in a thin, pale stripe. Dust floated through it in slow patterns, peaceful and unaware of the tension between us. I stared at it for a moment, grounding myself in the quiet movement. It helped just enough. When she finally paused, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator again. The house felt still, holding its breath. I let out a slow exhale I didn't realize I'd been holding. My chest ached, not from anger, but from the sudden understanding that the world I woke up to was already gone. And as I sat across from Rachel, absorbing the weight of her certainty, a dull ache settled deeper inside me. An ache that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with what her words had just changed. Growing up with Rachel never felt simple. Even as kids, there was always a quiet edge beneath her smile, a tension that showed in small ways most people wouldn't notice. I remember how she'd grip the straps of her backpack a little too tightly whenever she didn't get her way, or how her voice would take on a sugary tone right before she asked for something she knew she wasn't supposed to have. Those little patterns felt harmless back then, just quirks of childhood. But looking back now, they read like early clues I hadn't known how to interpret. I can still picture the way she used to hover near me whenever Mom bought us something new. She'd admire it loudly, complimenting every detail, while her fingers traced the edges with a kind of longing that made me uncomfortable. She never grabbed things outright, not at first. Instead, she'd wait until I set something down, then quietly adopt it as if it belonged to her all along. If I asked for it back, she'd act confused, as though I was imagining things. Her calm confidence made me doubt myself, even when I knew exactly what had happened. In school, teachers always praised her for being articulate and composed. She had a way of speaking that made adults lean in, believing every word she said. I remember watching her once, explaining to a teacher why she'd forgotten her homework. The story flowed out of her effortlessly, detailed and emotional, and I saw the teacher's expression melt into sympathy. Meanwhile, I stood beside her, stunned because I knew she had simply chosen not to do the assignment. That moment stuck with me, not because she lied, but because she did it so smoothly. At home, Mom tried to treat us equally, but even she couldn't always untangle the situations Rachel created. Whenever something went missing, a bracelet, a few dollars, a toy, Rachel would calmly insist she had no idea where it went. She said it with such steady conviction that Mom often gave her the benefit of the doubt. I didn't push back much. I didn't like conflict, and Rachel seemed to thrive in it. She'd tilt her head slightly, watching me with an expression that dared me to challenge her story. Most of the time, I stayed quiet. There were moments, though, when the facade slipped. I'd catch her expression tightening when Mom praised me for something, or I'd see her jaw clench if I received a gift she wanted. Those were fleeting moments, gone as quickly as they appeared, replaced by that same smooth confidence she wore so easily. But even then, something inside me sensed the imbalance. It felt like an invisible thread pulling between us, straining a little more each year. As teenagers, the pattern continued. Rachel always had an explanation, always a reason she deserved a little more or needed something urgently. If I questioned her, she'd twist the situation until I felt guilty for even asking. She had a way of sighing softly, as if burdened by my lack of understanding. It worked more often than I'd like to admit. I learned to pick my battles carefully, though I never quite understood why it mattered so much to her. Mom noticed the tension sometimes. She'd place a gentle hand on my shoulder after an argument and say Rachel meant well, that she was just under pressure or dealing with things she didn't know how to express. I wanted to believe that. I held on to that belief longer than I should have. Mom always tried to see the best in people, especially her own children. I guess I inherited that from her, for better or worse. There were moments of closeness mixed in too, which made everything more confusing. Times when Rachel would braid my hair or share secrets whispered between bunk beds. Those memories created a sense of loyalty that kept me from questioning her more deeply. I thought siblings in every family had struggles, that ours were just part of growing up. I didn't realize I was normalizing behavior that would later become something much heavier. By the time we were adults, Rachel had perfected her ability to present herself however she wanted others to see her. To the world, she was polished, responsible, even generous when the moment called for it. But behind closed doors, there was always a subtle tension, an expectation that things should bend her way. She carried herself with the quiet certainty that she deserved more, even if she never said it outright. I learned to adapt, smoothing conflicts before they escalated, convincing myself it was just part of maintaining family harmony. Mom tried in her gentle way to remind us that family mattered above everything. She'd tell stories about her own siblings, about forgiveness and unity, hoping we'd grow into adults who supported one another. I think she believed we would eventually find balance. Maybe she thought time would soften the edges between us. I didn't want to disappoint her, so I buried the discomfort and shaped myself around the tension instead. Still, certain memories linger, like the way Rachel's eyes would narrow for a split second whenever something didn't go her way, or the way she'd rearrange conversations to suit her narrative. Those moments resurfaced quietly in my mind whenever I felt uneasy around her, but I pushed them down. I didn't want to label my sister as someone who could hurt me. I didn't want to accept what those patterns might mean. Standing in my kitchen that morning, watching her lay out those papers with that familiar, practiced calm, those old memories flickered through me in a way I couldn't ignore. It was as if the past had stepped forward, tapping me on the shoulder. And for the first time, I let myself acknowledge that maybe the things I had brushed aside growing up weren't harmless after all. Mom always tried to bridge the growing distance between Rachel and me, even when she pretended not to notice it. She had this gentle way of smoothing tension with small gestures, leaving handwritten notes on the fridge, cooking our favorite meals on stressful days, or pulling us both into the living room for what she called reset moments. They weren't lectures, just quiet conversations where she'd remind us that family was supposed to be a safe place, not a battleground. I used to feel guilty when she did that, like I was somehow failing her by not knowing how to make things easier between us. I remember one particular afternoon from a few years back. Mom and I were in her garden, planting marigolds along the fence line. The dirt was warm under my fingernails, and the late spring breeze carried the smell of fresh blossoms. She paused at one point, brushing soil from her hands, and asked gently if Rachel and I were finding better footing. I told her we were fine, even though I wasn't sure that was true. She smiled softly, the kind of smile that said she didn't completely believe me, but hoped things would work out. She always hoped. Mom had a way of making her care feel effortless. She'd call me just to check if I had eaten or to share some small, silly story from her day. She did the same for Rachel, though sometimes the conversation seemed more strained. I could hear the careful tone in her voice when she spoke to my sister, the kind she used when she didn't want to make someone defensive. I wondered sometimes if Rachel sensed it. She had a sharp intuition when it came to people noticing her moods. Even in small moments, Mom saw the best in both of us. When Rachel showed up late to family dinners, Mom would set aside a plate, whispering that she was sure Rachel had a long day. When I seemed overwhelmed at work, she'd leave a voicemail reminding me to take breaks, her voice warm and steady. She was the kind of person who spread softness into every corner of life without even trying. Losing that softness felt like losing a sense of gravity. In the months before she passed, Mom had grown quieter, but not in a way that felt alarming. She moved more slowly, took more breaks, but still insisted she was fine. She brushed off my concerns with a gentle wave of her hand, saying she was just feeling her age. But I noticed the way she rubbed her chest sometimes, pressing her palm there as if she were trying to soothe something deep inside. And there were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, where her breath caught mid-sentence. I asked if she'd seen a doctor. She promised she would. Rachel, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did and chose not to acknowledge it. She'd breeze in and out during those months, always rushing somewhere, always distracted. Mom didn't pressure her. She never wanted to make either of us feel guilty. Still, I sometimes felt a quiet resentment building in me, though I never said anything. I wanted to believe the bond between sisters would straighten itself out in time. Looking back, our childhood patterns followed us into adulthood more than I realized. Rachel continued making decisions without explaining them, assuming things would simply fall into place according to her needs. And I kept smoothing over the tension, telling myself that family is supposed to bend without breaking. Mom's health decline only made me more determined to keep the peace between us, even if I was the only one working at it. Mom spent her last weeks in and out of the hospital. The walls in those rooms were a sterile white, the air dry and cool. I remember sitting beside her bed, holding her hand while she slept, listening to the faint beep of the monitors. She looked smaller there, wrapped in blankets that seemed too heavy for her frail frame. The smell of antiseptic always lingered on my clothes afterward. Those days left an imprint on me that still feels raw. Rachel visited, though not as often as I hoped. When she did, she stayed for short stretches, her movements always brisk, her phone never far from reach. She'd sit beside Mom, legs crossed neatly, offering updates about her life in a tone that felt more like a report than a conversation. Mom would smile, grateful for the company, even if the visits were brief. I tried not to judge. Everyone handles illness differently, but something inside me couldn't shake the quiet imbalance of it all. The night Mom passed felt both sudden and expected. The hospital room was dim, lit only by a small lamp near the doorway. I held her hand until it grew still, the rhythm of her breath fading like a soft tide retreating. The nurses were gentle, speaking in low voices, guiding me through the steps of what came next. I remember the sterile smell, the coolness of her skin, the way my fingers trembled as I brushed back her hair. Those sensations returned to me at odd times, uninvited but vivid. When I called Rachel that night, she answered quickly, her voice sharp with surprise. She said she was on her way, but she didn't arrive until nearly an hour later. She moved through the room quietly, her eyes wide but dry. She hugged me stiffly, her perfume strong in the small space. There was no trembling in her hands, no wavering in her voice. She stood beside the bed for a moment, her expression unreadable, then stepped back, folding her arms across her chest as though bracing herself for something logistical rather than emotional. In the days that followed, I thought maybe grief would soften the lines between us. I thought losing Mom might finally bring us closer, but instead, it felt like it pushed us further apart. Standing in my kitchen the next morning, watching Rachel sit with that folder and that unwavering composure, I realized just how different our worlds had become, and how little I truly understood about the person my sister had grown into. In the days leading up to Mom's passing, I kept replaying small moments in my head, little signs I didn't recognize as warnings at the time. It's strange how grief sharpens your memory, illuminating things you brushed off when life still felt stable. One moment kept resurfacing, the last real conversation Mom and I had, sitting together in the living room with the soft hum of the air conditioner filling the pauses. She held a mug of chamomile tea, her fingers wrapped around it as if she were trying to warm herself from the inside out. She mentioned her accounts that night, casually at first. She asked if I remembered how to access certain things, just in case. I had nodded, more focused on the tired look in her eyes than the content of her words. She had always been organized, meticulous about bills, insurance, and financial documents. I didn't think much of it then, but now, looking back, something about her tone felt heavier, like she had been quietly preparing for a reality neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I remembered how she paused mid-sentence, pressing her hand to her chest as if steadying herself. The lamp beside her cast a warm glow across her face, softening the lines of age and stress. I had offered to drive her to the doctor again, but she insisted she was fine. She always did that, shielded us from worry even when she needed support. I didn't push hard enough. I can admit that now. At the time, I thought I was respecting her independence. Now it just feels like a missed chance. There were other signs too, subtle but persistent. She started carrying folders around the house, thin stacks of papers tucked under her arm or placed neatly on the kitchen counter. When I asked about them, she said she was tidying up loose ends. I didn't question it further. I didn't want to pressure her, but I noticed the way she would pause before answering, as if deciding how much to tell me. I chalked it up to her being tired, not realizing she was quietly preparing for a future we weren't ready for. The last Sunday we spent together still sits heavy in my chest. She had made breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and the fruit salad she knew I loved. She moved slowly around the kitchen, leaning against the counter when she thought I wasn't looking. Her hands trembled slightly when she passed me my plate. I offered to help, but she brushed it off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Even then, I convinced myself she was just having an off day. As we ate, she mentioned Rachel more than usual, not in a critical way, but with a soft concern I didn't fully understand. She asked if we were getting along better. She asked if I felt overwhelmed by anything. I reassured her, telling her we were fine, that it was just normal sibling friction. She nodded thoughtfully, stirring her tea slowly, watching the steam curl upward like she was searching for something in it. I didn't press her, though maybe I should have. A week before she passed, she asked me to help her sort through a drawer in her bedroom. The air in the room felt warm and faintly scented with her lavender lotion. Papers were stacked neatly inside the drawer, some in envelopes, some clipped together. She handed me specific things to place in a binder: insurance papers, a handwritten list of contacts, copies of legal documents. She worked slowly, occasionally pausing to catch her breath. At one point, she rested her hand on my arm, giving me a small, grateful smile. I didn't know that was the closest she came to asking for help. I didn't understand why she wanted everything so organized at once. I thought maybe she was preparing for a trip or simplifying things for retirement. I didn't consider she might be preparing for something else entirely. She didn't mention her finances specifically that day, but she did say something that makes sense only now. She told me she wanted things to go where they were meant to go. I laughed lightly, teasing her about being dramatic. She laughed too, but there was a sadness in her eyes I didn't grasp then. Rachel appeared less during those weeks, and when she did, her visits were short. She would breeze in with her phone in hand, tapping messages even as she hugged Mom. I noticed the way Mom's eyes lingered on her, searching for something: attention, maybe, or reassurance. But Rachel always seemed eager to leave. I remember thinking I should have talked to her about it, encouraged her to spend more time with Mom. But part of me didn't want to start a conflict. I kept choosing peace, even at the cost of honesty. One moment in particular gnaws at me. Mom and I were in the car together, driving back from one of her appointments. The sun was low, brushing the windshield with a warm orange glow. She asked, almost hesitantly, whether Rachel had talked to me recently about future matters. I told her no, confused by the question. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. I didn't think to ask what she meant. I regret that deeply now. When I try to piece it together, I can see the threads Mom tried to lay out for me. Gentle hints, quiet gestures, small preparations. But I didn't recognize them then. I was too focused on her staying here, too unwilling to imagine a world where she wouldn't be. I ignored the subtle signals that she wanted me to be ready, that she needed me to pay attention, that something important was at stake. And sitting at the kitchen table that morning, with Rachel's folder spread out between us, I finally understood how much I had missed. Rachel didn't open the folder right away. She just sat there, perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the edges, as if she wanted me to notice how calm she was. That was the first moment something inside me tightened. Not panic, not yet, but a quiet alertness. Grief heightens your senses in odd ways. The scrape of her chair against the floor sounded too loud. The way she tapped her index finger against the manila cover felt rehearsed. Even the air around us seemed to shift, thinner somehow. She finally flipped the folder open, revealing papers I didn't immediately recognize: printed statements, clipped documents, a few handwritten notes. The neat arrangement made my stomach twist. Rachel wasn't someone who organized things unless she wanted something. She preferred improvising her way through life, convincing others to handle the details. So seeing her prepared, precise, almost formal, made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. She cleared her throat softly, a sound that floated through the room like a warning signal wrapped in politeness. I watched her fingers glide along one of the papers, the way she avoided meeting my eyes. It wasn't grief that kept her gaze down. It was focus, intention. That realization settled heavily in my chest. I tried to breathe evenly, but the morning felt suddenly weighted, like I'd stepped into a conversation that had begun long before I arrived. The silence stretched. I forced myself to take a sip of my coffee, though the taste had gone bitter. The warmth didn't soothe me anymore. It only reminded me how cold the rest of the room felt with her sitting there. She finally looked up at me, calm, composed, almost businesslike. The expression didn't match the moment. It didn't match anything about the last 24 hours. That disconnect carved a small, uneasy ache inside me. She started talking, not about Mom, not about memories, not about anything that felt human. She launched straight into important matters, with a tone so flat and smooth it felt detached from reality. Her voice was steady, almost practiced, as if she had rehearsed this speech in her car on the way over. I watched her lips move, but for a few seconds, the words didn't register. All I heard was the strange disconnect between us, a gap widening with every sentence she spoke. When her meaning finally clicked, a cold ripple ran through me. She was talking about Mom's finances, not in a hesitant way, not with uncertainty or tenderness. She was speaking with the certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome. She said it with the confidence of someone who believed she was simply stating a fact. I felt the room tilt, the edges of my vision tightening slightly as my heartbeat quickened. She shifted one page toward me, a bank document of some kind, though the numbers blurred as soon as I saw them. My fingers twitched, but I didn't reach for it. I couldn't. Something about her eagerness, her precision, made it clear this wasn't an emotional conversation. It wasn't even a collaborative one. Rachel wasn't informing me. She was delivering a verdict she expected me to accept. Her posture told me everything her words didn't. The slight lift of her chin, the way she held her shoulders back, the controlled breaths she took between sentences. She was bracing for resistance, but expecting compliance. I recognized that stance from years of subtle power plays, years of her twisting situations just slightly enough to gain the upper hand. Only this time, the stakes were impossibly higher. As she talked, she kept glancing at the folder, not at me. That tiny detail struck me like a quiet alarm. If her intentions were transparent, she'd look me in the eye. But her gaze kept drifting downward, as if she didn't want to see my reaction, or as if she feared seeing something she wasn't ready to confront. My grief sat uncomfortably alongside the rising unease. I tried to focus, tried to anchor myself in the physical details of the moment. The cool surface of the table under my palms, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the sunlight stretching across the floor in thin, pale lines. Those details grounded me just enough to keep listening. But every word from her mouth felt like a slow unraveling of something I thought I understood about my family. She spoke with such conviction about what made sense, what should be handled, what Mom would have wanted. But underneath the polished tone, I sensed something else, a subtle urgency, a quiet desperation wearing a mask of control. Her sentences were too carefully constructed, her explanations too convenient. It felt less like sharing information and more like trying to cement a narrative before anyone could question it. I felt my throat tighten, not because of what she was saying, but because of what she wasn't saying. There was no softness, no hesitation, no acknowledgement of the moment we were standing in, the first morning without Mom. Instead, there was a cold efficiency that made my skin prickle. The more she talked, the more a quiet realization settled to me like a weight. She hadn't come to grieve with me. She hadn't come to sit in the stillness of loss or share memories of the woman who raised us. She had come with an agenda, and whatever it was, she had decided it long before she knocked on my door. The folder between us felt like a boundary line she had drawn, one she expected me to step over without question. But as I sat there, trying to process her composed urgency, something inside me shifted, small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. I understood now. This wasn't the beginning of a conversation. It was the beginning of a battle I hadn't realized I was already part of. I didn't expect the air in Mom's house to feel so heavy the next morning. The sun filtered through the curtains in these muted, dusty beams that made everything feel older than it was. I walked through the hallway slowly, touching the edge of the wallpaper, feeling a strange mix of comfort and dread pooling in my stomach. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just wanted to feel connected to her, even if it was only through the familiar creak of the floorboards. When I reached her bedroom, I hesitated at the door. The smell of lavender lotion still clung to the air, soft and fading, the way her presence felt now. My eyes drifted around the room, landing on small things I never paid attention to. Her glasses on the nightstand, the half-used candle, the old radio she listened to every morning. Everything seemed frozen, as if even the room wasn't ready to accept she was gone. I sat on the edge of her bed and rubbed my hands over the blanket, feeling the worn fabric beneath my palms. I thought I was ready for this, ready to face whatever responsibilities waited for me. But grief has a way of slowing everything down, pulling at your thoughts until every step feels heavier than the last. I let out a long breath and tried to steady myself. That's when I noticed it, an envelope sticking out from under her pillow. It wasn't hidden exactly, just placed in a way that suggested intention. I reached for it with hands that suddenly didn't feel steady anymore. The paper was smooth, slightly worn along the edges, like it had been handled more than once. My name was written on the front in her familiar handwriting, slightly slanted to the right. Seeing my name like that made my throat tighten. I traced the letters with my thumb before opening the flap, trying to brace myself for whatever was inside. I half expected a short note, maybe something sentimental, something comforting. Instead, I found a folded form and a small card behind it. The form was from the bank. The card was a business card from a financial advisor Mom had mentioned once in passing, but never elaborated on. The form had one detail that pulled every bit of air out of my lungs. I was listed as the primary beneficiary on an account I didn't even know existed. I blinked at the numbers printed on the page, feeling my pulse suddenly thrum in my ears. $300,000. A number so large it felt unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life. I read the form again, then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding something. But the details were clear enough that a quiet tremor of confusion ran through me. Why hadn't Mom told me about this account? Why was this under her pillow instead of tucked away somewhere safer? And why did she write my name on the envelope, not Laura's? Especially knowing how involved my sister liked to be in everything financial. My first instinct wasn't excitement or relief. It was worry. Something about the secrecy felt wrong, like Mom was trying to protect something from the moment she passed. I kept staring at the signature line where her name rested in smooth ink, wondering what she had been thinking when she signed it. I sat still for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of the heater turning on in the hallway. The house felt too quiet, as if it was waiting for me to react. I folded the form back into the envelope and held it in both hands, feeling its weight settle in my chest. It wasn't just paper. It was a decision she made, deliberately and thoughtfully, and now it was mine to understand. I leaned back slightly, letting my eyes settle on the framed photo of us sitting on her dresser. It was from a vacation years ago, before Dad passed, before Laura and I drifted into this uneasy pattern of strained politeness. Mom was smiling brightly in the picture, her eyes soft and proud. I wondered if she had known, even then, that she would someday need to leave instructions behind instead of saying everything out loud. A soft knock echoed from the hallway, and for a split second I thought it was Mom. Grief does strange things like that. It messes with reality, twisting echoes into memories. But no one was there. It was just the house settling again. I placed the envelope on the bed beside me and rubbed my temples. The weight of responsibility, the uncertainty, the worry, it all pressed down at once. I didn't know what this meant for me, for Laura, or for the decisions we'd have to make in the next few days. I didn't even know where to begin processing the fact that Mom made a choice like this without telling either of us. But I did know one thing. Nothing about Mom's actions was ever careless. If she left this for me specifically, she had a reason. I wasn't sure what that reason was yet, but the thought made my chest ache with equal parts fear and gratitude. I picked up the envelope again, pressed it lightly to my chest, and closed my eyes. For the first time in days, I felt something steady beneath the grief, a sense that Mom had trusted me with something important, something she couldn't say out loud. And even though it left me with more questions than answers, I knew I wasn't ready to share it with anyone just yet. Not even Laura, that I didn't even have time to gather my thoughts before Laura called me. Her name flashed across my phone screen while I was still standing in Mom's room, the envelope pressed between my fingers. For a moment, I let it ring, trying to steady my breathing, but the call kept vibrating through the quiet house, breaking any chance I had of pretending things were normal. When I finally answered, her voice came through fast and sharp, as if she'd been rehearsing what to say. There was no softness, no hint of shared grief. Instead, she launched straight into questions: where I was, what I was doing, whether I'd found the documents. She didn't specify what documents, and something about that omission made my stomach tighten. Her tone was too eager, too focused for someone who had just lost her mother. I could almost hear the way she kept pacing, maybe tapping her nails against something the way she always did when she was thinking about money or logistics. I answered vaguely, keeping my voice as neutral as I could, even though my heart was pounding hard enough to make my hands feel cold. She told me she was coming to the house soon, and she emphasized the word in a way that made it clear she expected me to wait for her. No time frame, no reason, just that she needed to handle a few things. The moment she hung up, the silence pressed in around me again, heavier now, edged with unease. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, my fingers tightening instinctively. I didn't know what Laura suspected, or how much she knew, but something in her voice told me she felt entitled to something she assumed Mom left behind, and I had a sinking feeling she wasn't talking about sentimental belongings or old paperwork. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket, making sure it was secure before leaving Mom's bedroom. The house felt different now, as if Laura's voice had unsettled something inside its walls. I walked down the hallway slowly, touching the railing the way I used to as a kid, grounding myself in memories instead of tension. The living room still smelled faintly of coffee and the lemon detergent Mom liked to use. Sunlight stretched across the rug, highlighting the small imperfections woven into its pattern. I sat on the couch for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. My palms were slightly damp, and my shoulders felt tight, like I was subconsciously bracing for something. I replayed the call in my mind, word for word, trying to make sense of why Laura was so insistent. We hadn't even finalized funeral arrangements. We hadn't gone through Mom's things together. We hadn't cried together the way siblings usually do when they lose the one person who kept them connected. And yet, Laura's first concern was documents. A small part of me wondered if this had always been in her mind, this urgency, this expectation. Growing up, she was always the sibling who saw opportunities in every situation, sometimes even before the rest of us realized there was something to see. She had a way of leaning into control, of stepping into roles no one assigned her. Sometimes it was helpful. Other times it felt intrusive. Today it felt ominous. I rubbed my hands together slowly, the friction warming my skin enough to settle some of my nerves. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us, something that only Mom had been able to hold together. And now that she was gone, the cracks were widening. I stood and walked into the kitchen, needing something to do with my hands. I filled a glass with water and took a slow sip, letting the coolness settle my throat. The envelope pressed lightly against my side with every breath, a constant reminder of the secret resting between my sister and me, one I hadn't even had a chance to understand fully. The sound of a car door slamming outside made me freeze. I moved toward the front window and gently pulled the curtain back. Sure enough, Laura was already walking up the driveway. She moved briskly, her shoulders squared, her expression set in that familiar, determined line. She wasn't grieving. She was preparing. I stepped back from the window and let the fabric fall into place. My heartbeat quickened again, not out of fear but anticipation. I wasn't ready to talk to her. I wasn't ready to explain anything. And I definitely wasn't ready to answer questions I didn't fully understand myself. When the knock came, it was firm, louder than it needed to be. I took a slow breath and walked to the door, preparing myself as best as I could. I kept one hand near my pocket, feeling the outline of the envelope like a shield, even though I knew it wouldn't protect me from whatever conversation was about to unfold. I opened the door to find her standing there with a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze flicked over my shoulder, immediately scanning the house. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She asked again, directly this time, whether I'd found any of Mom's financial paperwork. Her voice was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, something brittle and impatient. I kept my answers short, careful, giving her nothing more than vague statements. Her brow tightened with each noncommittal response, and her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, like she expected to see something sitting in plain sight. As she moved around the room, I stood still, watching her carefully. I could feel the envelope pressed against my ribs with every inhale, and I knew instinctively that telling her about it now would change everything far too quickly. Whatever was happening between us had only just begun, and revealing Mom's letter now would only escalate things before I understood them myself. So I stayed quiet, and for the first time, I saw something in Laura's expression I couldn't quite name, something cold, calculating, and strangely certain. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope Mom had left, when the phone rang. The shrill sound made me jump, even though I had been expecting calls from relatives, the funeral home, or the bank. But there was a sharpness in that ring that set my nerves on edge, as if the universe was nudging me toward a moment I wasn't ready for. I hesitated before picking up, my fingers brushing the smooth surface of the envelope in my pocket. It felt heavier all of a sudden, as though it were anchoring me to something urgent I had yet to understand. "Hello," I said, my voice tight, controlled. The line crackled softly before a voice on the other end spoke. It was the bank, polite, professional, but with a note of urgency that made my stomach clench. They asked to confirm my identity, and as I answered, a sinking feeling started to form in the pit of my chest. Something about their tone told me this wasn't just a routine call about Mom's accounts. It was bigger. Something had already shifted while I wasn't paying attention. The banker's words hit me slowly, like a tidal wave building in the distance. They informed me that a claim had been made on Mom's account, significant, unmistakable, and recently initiated. My pulse quickened, and the paper in my hand, the envelope that had comforted me minutes ago, now felt like a ticking clock. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked for details, and every answer they gave made my jaw tighten further. Rachel's name came up, mentioned casually but formally, like she was already staking her claim. I felt a jolt of disbelief. My sister? That calm, composed presence sitting just a few rooms away. She had moved faster than I had imagined. She had acted while I was still trying to process Mom's death, still standing in the quiet house, holding memories like fragile ornaments. My stomach sank as I realized how calculated her timing had been. She hadn't waited for morning. She hadn't paused. She had seen an opportunity, and she seized it. The banker explained that they had called me first because of my status as the primary beneficiary. I had been listed as the one to receive access, to handle the account, and to make decisions in the wake of Mom's passing. The information was clear, direct, leaving no room for ambiguity. But the weight of it pressed down on me, making my chest tight. Rachel's urgency, her sudden presence, suddenly made sense in a way that was terrifying. She hadn't come for comfort. She had come to claim. I let the silence hang between my questions, trying to piece together what I knew from what the banker told me. The amount in question was substantial, more than I had ever imagined, more than I could reasonably spend in a lifetime. And yet the figure didn't matter nearly as much as the intent behind it. The cold, efficient precision with which Rachel had acted settled in my mind, a reminder of the sister I had known growing up, strategic, confident, relentless when she wanted something. I closed my eyes briefly, taking a slow, deliberate breath. My fingers brushed the edge of the envelope in my pocket again. It was strange how something so small could feel so significant. Mom's decision, her foresight, her trust in me. That envelope now represented both a lifeline and a shield. I realized I was standing at the intersection of grief and strategy, forced to reconcile mourning with the sudden need for careful, deliberate action. I listened carefully as the banker continued, outlining the procedures I would need to follow to assert my claim. Every step sounded like a maze, each one weighted with potential mistakes. One misstep could give Rachel the leverage she seemed to be quietly positioning for. My heart raced with both fear and resolve. I could feel the adrenaline mingling with the ache of loss. The grief from losing Mom now tangled with the knowledge that my sister was already plotting her path through the same house I had grown up in. I glanced toward the hallway, thinking of Rachel. She was probably still moving around, oblivious to the fact that the bank had already flagged the account in my name. The thought made my pulse thrum faster. She was sharp, meticulous, and clever, but she hadn't yet won. There was a momentary calm in realizing that the advantage Mom had given me could be acted on, that the envelope I had been holding could be more than a symbol of her trust. It could be my way to level the field. The call ended, leaving the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the wall clock in the room. I sat motionless, letting the words sink in. Everything I had known about that morning, about Rachel's urgency, about the folder she had carried in like a shield, suddenly snapped into clarity. Her confidence, her composure, all of it was part of the plan she had already set in motion. She hadn't come to grieve. She had come to claim. And now, thanks to Mom's foresight, I knew before she could act. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension roll off my shoulders, just enough to think clearly. There was no panic. There was no yelling. Only the quiet, simmering awareness that the next steps needed precision, patience, and intelligence. Rachel might have believed she was ahead, but the bank call had shifted everything. I had the upper hand, even if she didn't yet know it. I set the phone down, my fingers brushing the envelope again. The morning light had changed, spilling wider across the floor. Dust motes danced lazily in the beams, peaceful and unaware of the battle now quietly unfolding in the kitchen. I pressed my palms to the table, grounding myself in the texture, in the reality of the moment. Mom had trusted me with something precious, and I wasn't about to let that trust be undermined, not by grief, not by Rachel, not by anything. When Rachel finally wandered back into the kitchen, she had that same composed expression she always wore, like nothing could shake her. But I noticed a subtle edge in her movements, slightly quicker steps, fingers brushing against the counter, shoulders tight. She hadn't known I'd already spoken to the bank, and I could see that in the slight pause she took when she noticed me standing by the table, my hand casually resting near my jacket pocket. I didn't greet her with words. I simply watched her move, feeling the tension build in the room like a taut wire ready to snap. Rachel's eyes scanned the table first, then mine, as if she were measuring how much I had discovered. She tilted her head ever so slightly, that familiar calculating look that had been there since childhood. Something inside me shifted. The calm that had settled after the bank call wasn't enough. I needed to be deliberate now, careful with every movement, every word. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms neatly over her chest. "I wanted to make sure we handled Mom's things correctly," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. There was no softness, no hesitation. I didn't answer immediately. I let her words hang in the air, letting her feel the weight of their emptiness. It was a small thing, but I knew Rachel noticed when I didn't respond the way she expected. Her eyes flicked toward the envelope in my jacket pocket, though she didn't say anything. I could see the gears turning behind that composed face. She was analyzing, assessing, planning the next move. I pressed my lips together and leaned back against the counter, keeping my posture casual, deliberately unthreatened. I wanted her to underestimate me, to feel confident she was still leading the conversation. "I've already started going through some of Mom's paperwork," she continued, her tone now slightly sharper, testing my reaction. "It's important we don't miss anything." She paused, letting the words sink in. I know she had accounts, insurance policies, things she wanted sorted quickly. Her glance toward me lingered for a fraction too long. I recognized it from years of subtle manipulation. She was baiting me, trying to provoke a slip, a hint of surprise, a sign of weakness. I didn't give her one. I sipped water slowly, letting the coolness wash over me and steady my nerves. I kept my eyes on her casually, watching the way her jaw tensed ever so slightly when she realized I wasn't responding the way she expected. The envelope in my pocket felt like a secret shield against her growing assertiveness. Mom had left me something tangible, something that gave me both clarity and power, though I had to be careful with it. Rachel's movements became sharper, almost imperceptibly, as if the silence between us was pressing against her. She leaned forward, placing a hand lightly on the counter, and the scent of her perfume wafted faintly through the room. I noticed it, but I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I let her feel the full measure of her own audacity, unchallenged but quietly observed. That tension was mine to hold. "I think it's best if we go through everything together," she said next, her tone softening just slightly, almost persuasive. "We shouldn't have any misunderstandings." Her eyes locked onto mine now, trying to measure agreement or compliance, but I simply tilted my head, as though considering her suggestion, letting the pause stretch just enough for her to feel it. The silence made her shift uneasily. There was a subtle flicker in her expression, the tiniest breach in her polished armor. I caught it immediately, a brief tightening around the corners of her mouth, a slight narrowing of her eyes. She realized that I wasn't naive, that I wasn't the same sister who had quietly accepted her quiet dominance over years of small things. Something unspoken passed between us, a silent recognition that this was no longer a matter of courtesy. This was about control, trust, and consequences. I finally spoke, slow and measured. "We'll need to be careful with Mom's accounts," I said, keeping my voice even. Not too soft, not too loud. "It's important to do this right." Nothing more. The words were simple, neutral, yet firm enough to let her know I understood more than she expected. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, her composure intact, but there was a subtle edge of calculation in her gaze now. I could feel it. She was reassessing, recalibrating. The rhythm of her steps and the slight tension in her posture confirmed what I already knew. She was preparing for the next move, but the balance had shifted. The bank call had given me foresight she didn't anticipate. The room felt smaller suddenly, charged with unspoken intentions. The sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the dust motes dancing lazily in the beams, peaceful and unaware, a stark contrast to the tension vibrating between us. Every detail, the cold table surface under my palms, the smoothness of my chair, the faint ticking of the wall clock, became a part of the awareness I needed to maintain. I couldn't let her see any weakness, any crack in my attention. For the first time, I realized the quiet truth. The envelope wasn't just Mom's last gesture. It was my leverage, my way to navigate the coming storm. And Rachel, calm, composed, calculating Rachel, was no longer just my sister. She had become the first challenge I had to face in a family now reshaped by loss, trust, and the invisible rules of inheritance. I let out a slow breath, pressing my palm to the envelope in my pocket, and watched her move around the kitchen with that familiar precision. I wasn't intimidated. Not yet. The next few days felt like walking a tightrope over a shadowed canyon. Rachel didn't leave the house entirely, but she began hovering near the areas I needed to access, claiming she just wanted to help. Her voice was calm, measured, but I could sense the underlying calculation. Every step she took, every slight tilt of her head, carried the weight of someone trying to establish control without being overt. I kept my distance, observing, listening, waiting for an opening she might not realize I had. We moved carefully through Mom's belongings together, but it was a fragile truce at best. Rachel's hands lingered over certain files longer than necessary, her eyes flicking to my reactions as if to gauge what I knew and what I didn't. She had always been skilled at reading people, but I had learned to mask my thoughts, keeping my expressions neutral, my body language unremarkable. It was a subtle battle of wills, quiet but tense, unfolding in the still air of the house. At night, the house felt even heavier. The shadows lengthened across the walls, and the creaks of the floorboards became sharper, like warnings. Rachel would retreat to her room, doors closed, and I would sit with the envelope Mom had left me, reviewing it again and again. I memorized the details, committed the account numbers and the instructions to memory. Every time I held that paper, it felt like holding a map in a labyrinth I had no choice but to navigate alone. I noticed the way Rachel adjusted her behavior, subtle changes that betrayed her usual composure. She became overly polite at times, leaning just enough to suggest collaboration, as if trying to lull me into trust. And other times, she would leave notes or place documents strategically on the table, hoping I would make a mistake, hoping I would act too quickly. The tension between us grew almost imperceptibly, like a slow drip of water carving a groove into stone. One afternoon, I caught her going through Mom's old checkbooks. Her movements were deliberate, almost gentle, but there was a precision in the way she handled the pages that felt invasive. I asked her lightly if she needed help, keeping my tone casual, and she smiled, nodding, but the slight hesitation in her eyes betrayed her. She hadn't expected me to notice the carelessness in her approach. That small awareness gave me a sense of quiet power. Meals became tense affairs. We sat together at the table, the sound of silverware clinking against plates punctuating the uneasy silence. Rachel would comment on trivial matters, carefully choosing subjects that kept the conversation light, but also subtly probing. I answered minimally, aware that every word might give her an advantage. The house felt smaller each day, the air thick with the weight of unspoken strategies. I could feel her assessing me with every glance, and I matched her observation with equal caution. Sometimes I caught her lingering near the office desk where the envelope rested. Her shadow would fall over it briefly, and I would notice her slight hesitation, a breath held, a finger lightly touching a corner of a document before she moved away. It was a silent negotiation of boundaries, my vigilance against her subtle encroachments. The stakes felt immense, more than money or property. This was about control, about respect, about proving who could navigate Mom's intentions without succumbing to opportunism. I started creating small routines, methods to keep the envelope and its information secure. I memorized when Rachel stepped out, when she was distracted, when the house was quiet. I moved documents, kept copies in secure spots, and made mental notes of every detail she attempted to manipulate. The process was exhausting, but it was necessary. Every precaution was a step toward maintaining the balance Mom had entrusted me with. A quiet homage to her foresight. By midweek, the tension had settled into a strange rhythm. Rachel and I moved through the house like chess pieces, each aware of the other's potential strategies, but careful not to provoke a confrontation too early. There were moments when her tone softened, when she laughed at a memory of Mom, or when she helped organize a drawer without hesitation. Those moments were fleeting, but they reminded me that beneath the calculation, there was still the sister I had grown up with, a complex mix of loyalty, ambition, and charm. Yet, the awareness of her intentions never fully left me. Every gesture, every smile, every carefully chosen word was a reminder that this was no ordinary sibling rivalry. It was an intricate dance, one I had to navigate with patience and clarity. I couldn't rush, couldn't reveal the envelope, couldn't allow grief to cloud my judgment. Mom had trusted me, and I intended to honor that trust, even if it meant enduring days of quiet tension, subtle threats, and the constant vigilance that Rachel's presence demanded. And in the quiet moments, when the house finally slept, I would sit with the envelope, feeling the weight of responsibility settle into my hands. The trust Mom had placed in me was tangible now, as real as the tension in the rooms where Rachel lingered. And for the first time, I understood that victory in this struggle wouldn't be about confrontation or argument. It would be about intelligence, patience, and the quiet application of the advantage Mom had given me. It happened almost by accident. I was going through one of Mom's old filing cabinets, a routine I had established to familiarize myself with her papers, when I noticed a folder tucked behind the others. Its color was faded, the corner slightly bent, and it didn't have any label. At first, I hesitated, the sense of intrusion pressing against me. But something compelled me to open it. A quiet curiosity mingled with the awareness that Mom had left me subtle guidance for moments exactly like this. Inside were a series of notes, all in her handwriting. Some were lists, others short paragraphs, written with her characteristic clarity and care. I ran my fingers over the pages, feeling the faint imprint of her pen on the paper. Each line seemed deliberate, each word carefully chosen. And then I saw it. A note that was unlike the others, more personal, almost secretive, as if it were meant only for me to find once the initial chaos had passed. The note detailed her wishes regarding her finances, her accounts, and her intentions for Rachel. She wrote that she loved both of us dearly, but had known for years that Laura had a tendency to act quickly when it came to money. Mom explained that she had deliberately structured the accounts in a way that required careful handling, leaving the primary beneficiary in my name to ensure that the funds were used responsibly. Every detail was mapped out, account numbers, instructions for verification, and even a plan to alert me before any third party acted on a claim. I felt my heart pound as I read the words. Mom had anticipated everything: Laura's possible impatience, her composure, her subtle manipulations. and she had trusted me to navigate it intelligently, without confrontation or rashness. The weight of that trust settled in my chest like a physical presence, warm and heavy, almost protective. It was as if Mom was there with me, whispering guidance through the faded ink. As I continued, I discovered something else, a timeline, meticulously noted. Mom had arranged for the bank to call me first, to ensure I knew before anyone else could act. She had foreseen that Laura might move quickly, and she had built in safeguards. Every precaution had been taken, every possibility accounted for. The realization made my stomach tighten. Mom hadn't just left me money. She had left me a plan, a strategy, a way to protect the trust she placed in me. I sat back for a moment, holding the folder to my chest, and let the enormity of it sink in. I thought of Laura pacing through the house, unaware that her carefully rehearsed steps were already anticipated. I thought of the tension-filled days we had endured, the subtle tests, the quiet battles of observation, and I realized that Mom had designed all of it as a lesson, a final exercise in discernment, patience, and responsibility. The notes also revealed something more subtle, Mom's observations about our personalities. She had written about my tendency to overthink, but also about my commitment to integrity, about Laura's cleverness, but also her impatience. She had known, better than anyone, how we would each respond in this situation, and she had trusted that I would act wisely, not with aggression or deceit, but with intelligence and care. That trust now felt tangible, a thread connecting me to her even after she was gone. I returned to the envelope Mom had left beside me for days, the one that had carried the account details, and realized it was only one piece of a much larger design. The folder hidden behind the cabinet had been the real key. The blueprint Mom had left for handling not just her finances, but the dynamics between us, the unspoken challenges of loyalty, patience, and foresight. I felt a shiver of awe and gratitude. Mom had orchestrated everything, down to the smallest detail. I also understood why she had been so deliberate in keeping these things somewhat secret. Mom had wanted to preserve our relationship, to protect both of us from immediate conflict. She had known that Laura's instinct would be to claim quickly, and mine might have been to resist harshly. By leaving instructions and safeguards, she created a space where intelligence and patience could prevail over rash action and tension. It was a gift, hidden in plain sight. That night, I sat quietly in Mom's bedroom with the folder open on my lap, reading through the instructions again and again. The house was still, the only sounds the faint hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the wall clock. Rachel had retired for the evening, unaware that I now held the complete picture. I could feel the shift in power subtly, almost imperceptibly, and I knew the coming days would play out differently than she imagined. Mom had prepared me, and I was ready. For the first time, the burden of responsibility felt manageable, even purposeful. Mom's foresight had turned a situation that could have descended into conflict into a challenge of intellect and patience. And in that quiet room, surrounded by her handwriting, I felt a calm I hadn't known since the day she passed, a reassurance that her trust in me was not misplaced. The next morning, I could feel the tension in the house, like static electricity in the air. Rachel was moving about, cheerful on the surface, but I could sense the underlying calculation in every gesture, every step, every glance, every tilt of her head. She hadn't yet realized that I had discovered Mom's hidden folder, and I intended to keep it that way, at least for now. There was a rhythm to the household again, but it was one charged with quiet strategy rather than casual mourning. I found myself waiting for the right moment, the exact instant when the scales might tip, when I could act without revealing my hand prematurely. My fingers rested lightly on the envelope, the one Mom had left for me, a tactile reminder of her trust and foresight. I had memorized every detail, every number, every note. I knew the account as if it were part of me. That knowledge was my advantage. Though Rachel had no idea, she was no longer the one leading the game. She came into the kitchen, humming softly, the aroma of coffee filling the room. Her posture was relaxed, but I noticed the subtle twitch in her fingers, the slight narrowing of her eyes as she glanced at the table. She was assessing, searching for any indication that I might have acted or discovered something. But I remained calm, deliberately neutral, my expression unreadable. She hadn't yet cracked the code of Mom's design, and I could sense her frustration beginning to simmer just below the surface. I decided to take a step that would shift the balance without confrontation. I placed the envelope on the table casually, as if I were merely settling a stack of papers. My eyes never left her face, and I didn't speak. The air in the room seemed to pause. I could feel her instinctively registering the movement, the small weight of the paper on the table. And then came the flicker in her eyes, the momentary recognition that something had changed, that I was no longer uncertain, that I was ready. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her hand brushing the counter edge, the gesture almost imperceptible. Her voice, when it came, was soft, casual, but there was an edge in it I hadn't heard before. "So, have you had a chance to review Mom's accounts?" she asked, trying to gauge my reaction without giving away her own intentions. I simply nodded slowly, keeping my tone light, letting her think I was only beginning to process the information. I could feel her scanning me, trying to detect weakness, hesitation, or confusion. There was none. I decided to speak, carefully choosing my words. "Yes," I said quietly, almost matter-of-factly. "I've gone through everything Mom left. I think she wanted me to handle it carefully, to make sure nothing was rushed or mismanaged." I paused, letting the weight of that statement settle between us. Rachel's posture stiffened, just slightly, her smile faltering. I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, calculating how to respond, how to reclaim control. I continued, keeping my voice calm but steady. She trusted me to manage the accounts responsibly. She left clear instructions, and I intend to follow them exactly. The words weren't confrontational, but they carried authority, the quiet weight of certainty. Rachel's eyes flicked toward the envelope, and I let her see the slight crease where I had folded Mom's hidden notes. I didn't need to show her everything, just enough for the realization to sink in. For the first time, I saw her composure crack ever so slightly, a subtle shift in her breathing, a tightening around her mouth, the way her hands flexed briefly before settling. She had assumed control from the moment she entered the house, but that illusion was slipping. The balance had shifted, imperceptibly but irreversibly, because I now held knowledge she hadn't anticipated. Mom had prepared me for this moment, and it was here. Rachel's voice wavered just enough to betray her inner calculation. She tried again, suggesting collaboration, emphasizing fairness, and hinting at shared management. But the words rang hollow against the quiet authority I projected. I stayed still, calm, letting her try to navigate a situation she could no longer dominate. Every subtle attempt she made to regain the upper hand fell short because I had insights she hadn't considered. Mom's foresight embedded in her careful notes and structured plan. The tension in the room shifted further when I reached for the folder and placed it deliberately next to the envelope. Rachel's eyes widened fractionally, registering the tangible evidence of my understanding. She leaned back, adjusting her posture, the slightest flush creeping across her cheeks. It was the exact moment I had been waiting for. The moment she realized that the game had changed and that Mom's trust in me was not misplaced. I let the silence stretch, allowing the quiet power of that revelation to settle between us. No shouting, no accusations, no dramatic confrontation, just the calm, undeniable shift in the dynamic. Rachel understood now that I wasn't naive, that I wasn't unprepared, and that her initial confidence had been built on an assumption that no longer held true. And in that silent kitchen, with sunlight spilling over the table, I felt a sense of clarity, balance, and resolve that I hadn't known since Mom passed. The playing field had leveled, and the future was mine to navigate intelligently, deliberately, and honorably. After the revelation in the kitchen, the house felt different. The air was lighter, yet charged with a new sense of awareness. Rachel still moved about, polite, controlled, even friendly at times, but the subtle tension between us never left. I could sense her calculating, but now she did so with caution. Every step she took, every casual question she asked, I responded with measured calm. I never raised my voice, never accused, never let her know I knew the full extent of her intentions. That was the quiet power Mom had given me. I began organizing Mom's accounts, following her instructions down to the smallest detail. Each document I filed, each form I submitted, was done with precision. The bank had called multiple times, but I stayed patient, providing everything requested, confirming details exactly as Mom had written. I could feel Rachel watching, aware of my competence, aware that her attempts to control the process were no longer effective. She never complained aloud, never argued. She simply adjusted her pace, a subtle acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place. The quiet justice of it wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations or arguments, no scenes that would make the situation messy or draw attention. It was controlled, deliberate, and unassailable. Mom had left me a shield, a way to protect her wishes without creating chaos. And I used it, step by step, document by document, until everything she wanted managed was exactly that, managed. The sense of satisfaction was subtle but profound. It wasn't about winning against Rachel. It was about honoring Mom, and that, in itself, felt like justice. Rachel adjusted to the new dynamic. She became cooperative, her own ambition tempered by the knowledge that she could no longer claim what she wanted without following the rules Mom had established. I could see it in the small details. The way she double-checked forms after I had reviewed them. The way she hesitated before touching documents she once would have taken for granted. She had learned, quietly, that intelligence, patience, and preparation could outweigh boldness and speed. I also noticed changes in how she interacted with me. Her usual attempts at subtle manipulation softened. There was still a competitive edge, but it was balanced with respect, the kind that comes only after someone realizes they have been outmaneuvered fairly. We moved through the house with an unspoken understanding. There were no overt apologies, no grand acknowledgments, but the quiet respect settled between us in a way that had never existed before. Mom's foresight had orchestrated it beautifully. Every night, I would sit alone in the living room, reviewing the documents, checking the numbers again, and ensuring everything followed Mom's intent. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of the heater or the soft ticking of the clock. I kept the envelope close, a tangible reminder of the trust she had placed in me. Each night I felt more connected to her, more certain that the steps I was taking were right. And in that stillness, I allowed myself a small measure of satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing that justice had been served without a single harsh word. Rachel and I began to collaborate in a subtle, controlled way. She provided input when appropriate, followed my lead when necessary, and I guided her gently through the remaining steps. The atmosphere in the house shifted from tense and wary to quietly functional. There was still grief, of course, still the sense of loss and absence, but the shadows of conflict that had loomed so heavily in the first days had receded. Mom's plan had worked. It had protected her wishes and prevented a direct confrontation between us. I began to notice the smaller, human moments. Rachel laughing softly at something Mom had said in one of her old letters. Rachel pausing to help with a task, without being asked. The subtle ease in her posture when she realized that the tension between us had shifted permanently. It wasn't revenge in a dramatic sense. It wasn't about humiliation or anger. It was quiet, measured, and deeply satisfying. Mom's foresight had allowed me to act with intelligence, honor, and restraint, an unspoken lesson in the power of patience and preparation. By the end of the week, everything was settled. The accounts were properly assigned, all documents filed, and the bank had confirmed the completion of the transfers exactly as Mom had outlined. Rachel's ambitions had been guided into a framework she could respect, and I had maintained both the integrity of Mom's wishes and my own composure. The quiet justice in that moment was more satisfying than any confrontation could have been. Mom had trusted me, and I had honored that trust fully. Sitting in the living room that evening, the sunlight soft on the carpet, I reflected on the days that had passed. The tension, the anticipation, the careful navigation of Rachel's intentions. It all led to a moment of subtle but undeniable triumph. It wasn't about defeating her in anger or creating drama. It was about intelligence, patience, and the quiet power of honor. And in that quiet, I felt Mom's presence, proud, guiding me. Satisfied that her trust had been respected. In the weeks after everything was settled, the house felt quieter, softer, as though the weight of tension had finally lifted. Rachel and I moved through our routines with a cautious ease, the subtle competition replaced by a delicate understanding. There were no celebrations, no dramatic confrontations, just the quiet hum of life returning to a house that had been heavy with grief and uncertainty. I found myself breathing more freely, noticing small details I had missed in the early days. Sunlight on the floorboards, the faint scent of Mom's favorite candle lingering in the living room, the softness of the chair she used to sit in by the window. I reflected on the way everything had unfolded, realizing how much foresight Mom had built into her plans. She had known our personalities, our tendencies, and even the likely trajectory of our emotions. The envelope, the hidden folder, the detailed instructions, they weren't just about money. They were a lesson in trust, patience, and wisdom. Mom had given me a gift far greater than any account balance. She had given me a blueprint for handling difficult situations with intelligence, grace, and restraint. And I understood now that the true victory lay not in confrontation, but in quiet adherence to what she had envisioned. Rachel's behavior shifted in subtle ways over time. She became less forceful, more cooperative, and surprisingly reflective. I could see that she had recognized the fairness in Mom's design and my careful navigation of it. The lessons Mom had woven into her plans had not only protected her wishes, but had also tempered my sister's approach. It was a rare form of justice, one that required no shouting, no anger, no vindictive gestures. It was effective because it was intelligent and deliberate, rooted in preparation rather than impulse. I often thought about how fragile our relationships can be, especially when money, inheritance, and grief intersect. The first days after Mom passed were a test, not just of patience, but of character. And while Rachel had acted quickly, almost instinctively, I had taken the slower path, the one that demanded observation, analysis, and thoughtful action. In doing so, I realized that integrity and foresight were more powerful than boldness and aggression. Mom's trust had been placed wisely, and I was grateful to have honored it. There were quiet moments when I found myself alone in the house, sitting by Mom's window, the sunlight falling across her books and photographs. I would touch the pages of her journals, the edges of her letters, the small mementos she had kept tucked in drawers. Each one was a reminder of her guidance, her love, and the careful consideration she had shown us, even in death. The lessons she had left were subtle but enduring. Trust, patience, careful observation, and the power of thoughtful action. I thought about the notion of revenge, and how easy it can be to mistake it for satisfaction. True revenge, I realized, doesn't need to be violent, dramatic, or destructive. It can be quiet, deliberate, and intelligent. It can be the careful execution of principles and foresight in the face of someone else's impulsive ambitions. I didn't need to confront Rachel with anger or accusation. I simply needed to act in alignment with Mom's instructions, with patience, clarity, and respect for the intentions she had left behind. Over time, Rachel and I found a fragile but workable rhythm. We shared responsibilities in the house, sorted through belongings together, and maintained a balance that neither of us had expected. Our relationship was not perfect, nor fully healed, but it was functional, respectful, and grounded in the acknowledgement that intelligence and patience often outweigh bold action. Mom's guidance had created a space for us to navigate not just finances, but trust, loyalty, and shared responsibility in a way that minimized conflict and maximized fairness. Sometimes I would catch myself smiling at the thought that Mom had orchestrated all of this, leaving instructions that shaped the dynamics between us even after her passing. She had foreseen the potential for tension and had provided a way for it to be managed without drama or damage. I felt a quiet pride in my own actions, not because I had outwitted my sister, but because I had honored Mom's foresight, her trust, and her care. I had navigated the storm she left behind with integrity. In the stillness of the house, I finally allowed myself to grieve fully. The grief was no longer tangled with fear, anxiety, or tension. It was clear, unburdened, and soft. I could remember Mom with love, not worry. I could reflect on our childhood, our shared memories, our moments of laughter and conflict, and feel a deep connection that transcended the financial matters that had initially threatened to overshadow everything. In honoring her wishes, I had honored her life, her care, and the trust she had placed in me. And as the sun set over the house, spilling golden light across the rooms Mom had loved, I understood the most important lesson she had left. Intelligence, patience, and careful observation are stronger than force, entitlement, or haste. True justice does not need a shout. It can be quiet, deliberate, and enduring. Mom's legacy, her trust, and the quiet resolution of the days following her passing had shown me that, and I would carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life.